Good morning, everyone. We're just sorry for the slight delay. We've had a few technical hitches. This is our first webinar of a series of 5, so hopefully the starts will be slicker than this one, but I think we've worked out what the problems were. That's the good thing. We'll just give it a few minutes as we're a little bit delayed letting you all in from the lobby, and there were over 200 people registered for today's event, so just for a bit of patience. I'll give you a bit of my introduction as people join. As I say, there's over 230 people registered for today's event, and we've got some people from overseas. I know there's some interest from across Europe in the news that we've got to share with you today, so bienvenue à tous. If you're not French, I can't do any other languages, so I apologise for that, but you are all welcome. If you've joined the meeting already and you're in, welcome to everybody across the UK and across Europe. I think in the interest of time, I'll continue with my my welcome to everybody, because that's not really the bit you've come to listen to, but it does involve a few house rules which we can do while everyone's still coming into the meeting. So just for those who've just joined in the last few seconds, apologies for the technical hitches. We were a little bit delayed this morning getting the webinar started, but you're very welcome. My name is Chris Lloyd. I'm Secretary General for RUMA Agri, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's webinar. It's the first of 5 webinars in our conference series, which starts today and runs throughout November, with a webinar at 10 o'clock on every Wednesday. Today's webinar, of course, is looking at the RUMA Target Task Force report and the VARSS report launches. Effectively, today is our show and tell in terms of 2022 antibiotic sales data and the activities across the UK livestock sector which have contributed to ensuring the responsible use of these important medicines. It's a chance to get some insight into it's also a chance to get some insight into the latest abattoir surveillance for antimicrobial resistant bacteria, which sheds some light on how our change of use is being reflected in the resistant bacteria population. I'm conscious that people are still coming in, and I'm just going to repeat my apology to those who are just arriving. We had a few technical hitches prior to this morning's meeting, which we've ironed out, we hope. So if you're planning to join us for the next few conferences over the rest of November, hopefully we'll be slicker at the start, but you're all very welcome today. I'm joined by our presenters today, who are Kitty Healy, from the VMD, and she's head of the antimicrobial resistance team, and I'm chaired by my boss, chair of RUMA, Catherine McLaughlin, Cat McLaughlin, as we all know her. For those who've joined these sessions in the previous few years, Kitty and Cat will be well known to you as the presenters of the data that we've had in the last few years. We will also have a couple of other members of Kitty's antimicrobial team from the VMD who will join us later on for the question and answer session. So you may well be hearing from Tamsin Dew, who's head of AMR and surveillance, and Fraser Broadfoot, who's head of AMU surveillance and stewardship, and known to many of us who've in the UK. Before I hand over the floor to the speakers, just a few housekeeping rules. You'll see your cameras are off and your microphones are off. That's just so that we don't have any interference to the presentations. The Q&A function should now be enabled, so you can pose questions, and we will do our best to answer those questions during the course of the Q&A session at the end. We'll do both presentations and then go to the Q&A at the end. But if you want to type questions at any time during the presentations while you think of them, please do so, and we'll do our best to scroll back through those questions and review those when we get to the Q&A at the end. We'll do our best to answer all of the questions in the time that we have. We can run on till 11:30 UK time. But remember, we have 4 other webinars, so if you think of questions that might be relevant to those, or we see questions that might be relevant to those other sessions, we may hold them over for those. Before we finally get started, I want to take a moment to just thank everyone for the contributions to the development of both of these reports. Collating all of the information and cohesively presenting it is no small job and has involved many stakeholders from across all of the sectors and the UK livestock industry, as well as the teams in the VMD and RUMA who do the final collation and editing. It has taken a huge amount of work, time and effort, but has become an important part of demonstrating the UK position on antibiotic use and surveillance over the years. So my last reminder to you all is you can post your questions at any time, but now I'm going to hand over to Kitty, who's head of the antimicrobial team at the VMD, to give us the highlights from this year's VARSS report. Over to you, Kitty.
Thanks very much, Chris, and I will find my slides and share them with you. Okay, so Chris, would you mind confirming that you can see them okay?
Yep, that's looking good, Kitty. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, I won't introduce myself because it's already been done by Chris, so thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about the UK-VARSS 2022 report. So I know that a lot of people here will have been here for previous ones, but we love an acronym. The UK-VARSS report is the UK Veterinary Antibiotic Resistance and Sales Surveillance Report, which we publish every year. I am going to go hopefully reasonably briskly. There are lots of slides to talk you through, some with more detail than others, but let's get cracking. And we're going to start with the sales and the usage data. The sales data is the data that we get on the sales of antimicrobials, veterinary antimicrobials from the pharmaceutical companies, so right at that top level of the distribution chain. And the usage data, which sounds very similar, is what we get from either vet practices or farmers. So we have both of the ends of the sort of the distribution or supply chain there, and that also helps to act as a sort of checks and balances on validating the two data sets. And we'll start with the sales data. And this is the data which gives us our overall trend data. This is total UK veterinary antibiotic sales data. And this graph shows us two things. Well, this slide shows us two things. The main chart that you can see shows us the total sales adjusted for the animal populations. There are some complex metrics which are in the methodology, which are in the supplementary material of the VARSS report, if you're interested in the details. But what this essentially shows us is the trend in sales over time, and you can see that not only has it had that really steep decline back in 2014, which is what we use as our baseline year, but you can see that actually at the right of that chart, you can see that we've had another decrease in antibiotic sales data for the year 2022. So we're now down to 25.7 milligrams per kilogram, which is another new lowest figure for us, which is fantastic and remarkable. And that takes us to an overall 59% reduction since 2014. And if you look at the little diagram below that, that shows you the total tons. So that's not adjusted for population. And you can see there, right on the right-hand end, that for the first time at 193 tonnes in 2022, this is the first time since I can actually remember in the data that it's gone below 200 tonnes. So again, that's a nice new figure. You can also see then the percentage is slightly different between the tonnes and the mg per kg. That's just because of the different way these metrics are calculated. So then if we move on to HPCIAs, or highest priority critically important antibiotics. The highest priority and the critical importance relates to the fact that these are often first-line antibiotics for treating infections in people. And so this is something that we need to preserve the efficacy of in order to protect public health. And so this is why we monitor these, we track these carefully, and this is why they are also taken such great care of by vets and in the farming sectors. So you can see here the total HPCIA figure across the top is 0.12 milligrams per kilogram. So compared with 25 odd as the national figure, you can see that 0.12 is a very, very small proportion. In fact, it's less than 0.5% of the overall national usage. So you can see that these are being looked after carefully. The other thing you can see is that when we look back at 2014, we've had really significant reductions in all of these different classes, and I think it's fair to say that you'll see between 2021 and 22, in fact, all of the figures that we've got there look the same. In fact, if you look at the total HPCIA, the rounding masks a tiny increase, but when I say a tiny increase, this is an increase of 0.003 milligrams per kilogram. So I think that it's fair to say that these are staying steady. We've also looked at this in terms of route of administration. So in 2022, we continue to see more antibiotics being delivered in water. That makes up 45% of sales than in feed, excuse me, which is 31% of sales, which is a change over time, as you can see from the graph there. And of course, water treatment allows the treatment to be more easily targeted towards the animal. So that's consistent with a lot of the stewardship initiatives that we've been seeing. And so we move on to usage data now, which is done sector by sector. And in 2022, usage overall decreased across almost all of the sectors. And I'll talk you through that in the next few slides. So we'll start with pigs, which is still the overall highest using sector of antimicrobials at just over 56 tonnes. But despite that, we've seen consistently, and you can see its evidence here in the figure, we've seen consistent reductions and large reductions as well. That's to quantify what you're seeing, as you can see again in the chart at the top, 74% reduction since 2015. And in fact, just if you pull out the last 2 years, so between 2021 and 22, actually that's a 15.5 milligram per kilogram reduction, which is a sizable reduction just in the last year. So we're seeing continue to see the results of all of the efforts in the pig sector to reduce unnecessary use of antibiotics. Then moving on to the meat poultry sector, you see the overall picture is trends, as you can see there on the slide, which start with big reductions back in the earlier years, and then a sort of holding steady with a little bit of ups and downs, but essentially holding steady at that low level. We're not seeing regression to the higher levels that were used in the past. There's a very slight increase in use in the broiler sector this year. I want to say very slight, that's 0.4 milligrams per kilogram. But as I say, overall use in broilers for 2022 remains low at 14.1 milligrams per kilogram. And of course, when you get to that low stage of use in sectors, then it's not unexpected to find that things will go up a little bit and down a little bit from year to year. And I think the other thing to recognise in these sectors is the challenge of things like avian influenza on the whole sector. So I think that's the meat poultry slide. And then staying with poultry, we move to laying hens. And again, what we're seeing here is low use. We have a different metric for laying hens, which means that it's maybe a bit trickier to directly compare with some of the others. These are bird days that we look at here, which takes into account the number of birds treated compared with the time at risk. So I think what we can say here is that use is low, it's staying low, and it's continuing to reduce. And again, you can see that overall 65% reduction since 2016 when we first started reporting these data. So the next avian species sector we're looking at is the game bird sector. Now, in the game birds, we don't have the adjustment for the underlying population size. So what you're looking at here is tonnage in the bars, but we've also added an approximate population line in yellow at the top so that you can sort of track that. But we can't compare this at the moment in the same way that you can with the other sectors where we have adjusted for population. I think Therefore, it's difficult to pull out trends, but it is fair to say that in the last year, so between 2021 and 2022, the population fell by approximately 17%, but antibiotic use fell by 25%. So usage fell by more than the population. So, but again, as I say, difficult to put that into more detailed context. So then let's move on to fish. Now, those of you who monitor the trends in the VARSS report will perhaps remember that last year was a sort of a peak year for usage in the salmon sector. And you'll see here that what we've got is, in fact, a dramatic drop in usage in the salmon sector, a 57% drop between 2021 and 22. And I think this reflects a number of things. I'll reflect more generally on the fish sectors when I finish talking about trout as well. But I think certainly it reflects the sector's focus on stewardship and the collaborations between vets and farmers. But I won't go into more detail about the challenges in the sector, because I know that I think Kat's going to be talking a little bit more about that when she comes into her presentation. And then moving on to trout, so we've seen low levels of usage in trout historically, less than 20%, and in fact we've got a really quite significant, in that context, increase in use to just under 45 mg per kg. And again, this we've talked to the sector in order to understand this, and again, Kat's going to talk a little bit more about the detail of this, but it very much looks as though this is related to specific disease outbreaks that have been diagnosed appropriately, and that treatment has been given appropriately in order to manage those. And I think that this is where I come back to looking at the sectors together, but it's also true of other sectors too. But where you have sectors where a small number of disease outbreaks can have a disproportionate effect on the actual trends and the actual usage that you're looking at. And this is also particularly marked in sectors where the baseline usage is low. And I think that that's fair to say that this is the case when you're looking at both of these sectors. And finally, to close on this slide, to reflect that the spikes in usage where we've seen them have been related to the treatment of diagnosed disease. So this is one of the benefits of having these data, where we can actually come back to the origins and understand what's behind the data. Okay, so we've been talking there about the overall figures for usage in the different sectors. And this slide looks at the highest priority critically antibiotic data for usage. The one that we looked at before was for sales. So this is a complex slide. The first thing that I would like you to like to draw your attention to is actually the bottom two lines for pigs and meat poultry, and I think it's really worth looking at the fact that this reflects the very, very low use in tonnage and in mg per kg of HPCIAs in pigs and in poultry, and then the curves on the right hand side showing not only the dramatic initial decline and the maintenance of incredibly low levels of usage of HPCIAs, so that 99% reduction figure for both of those sectors. And I think that that's really impressive and worth pulling out and recognizing. And then moving to the trout and the game bird sectors further up. So I think it's also worth reflecting that both of these sectors are earlier in the journey for overall reductions, for monitoring usage, and for reporting HPCIA usage. And it's also worth, even though you're seeing there on the usage data that they are both using more in terms of quantity, but you're also seeing a significant reduction, so 67% reduction and 64% reduction, which to me, the magnitude of the reduction is reflective of the efforts of a sector and the commitment of a sector to make changes. And so I think that that's an important thing to be looking at here. I should have mentioned at the beginning, in fact, the column where you're seeing the the little circles, that reflects kilograms, not tons. So this is again reflects the fact that the usage of HPCIAs is very low overall. Again, I think with game birds, I think 2021 was a difficult year, but we know, and there are statements in the VARSS report reflecting the commitment of the sector for maintaining the downward trend that you can see on the right hand side for HPCIA usage. And for trout, again, the picture is complicated in the trout sector because of the low availability of antibiotics in general, the small number of active substances available. And I think that the usage that we're seeing here reflects the fact that oxalinic acid, which is a quinolone, is essentially what we're seeing as the data being reported. And of course, that's relatively recently been included in the HPCIA classification. So there are a number of other initiatives going on, which I think perhaps we haven't got the time to discuss here. But I think this again, it's useful for showing that the situation is complex, but the data are helpful for understanding the underlying circumstances and the fruits of the labour of the different sectors and the direction of travel. So onto ruminants. So one thing to reflect and to really welcome in this report is that this is the first time that we've published ruminant antibiotic use data, which has been collated through the Medicines Hub, which is run by HDB. So this is the central AMU database. So that's fantastic to see that that's up and running and receiving data. But because of where we are in that process, you can see from the information here that we've only got 6, 9, 28% of the beef, sheep, and dairy sectors respectively, which is really too low a coverage to present as representative of the sectors. So we look forward to doing that in the VARSS reports to come, but this is definitely a step forward, having the results from the central database in this year's VARSS report. And I know that we're focusing really here on the agriculture sectors, but this is an interesting slide, and hopefully you'll find it interesting too in terms of the companion animal usage, which are reported as another metric, DDD vets per animal. So this takes into account the length of activity of the active substance, the average daily dose rate, and the DDD vet figures, which are used for calculating this metric. So I think what are the key messages here? Well, I think that one thing, if you look, you've got dogs and cats on both of these graphs. You've got total usage on the left-hand side, and you've got HPCIAs on the right-hand side. And one thing that jumps out immediately is, we've just been talking about HPCIAs in livestock animals. Well, actually, you can see here that in cats, there's a much higher use of HPCIAs than in dogs, and in fact, I believe that if you look at the percentage of total usage of antibiotics in cats that is made up of HPCIAs, the actual percentage using this metric is 44%. So you can see that there's a world of difference here between companion animal and cats in particular, and livestock, and that's something which is definitely being looked at actively. Different medicine though, different situations, but I think I'll pause there because this is for the companion animals. But I would say do come along to the RUMA webinar, which I think is on the 15th of November, which focuses more on companion animals, and there's a lot of really good work going on there to look at this. Okay, so just checking the time. On to the resistance part of the data. So the harmonized monitoring, as we call it, when we're looking at antimicrobial resistance in healthy poultry at slaughter, and we alternate these years between poultry and pigs. And so we'll start with the first slide, which shows our indicator, our key indicators for resistance. Now, this is the only one of the slides here which is actually looking at, it's incorporating the pig data as well as the poultry data. So I said that we alternated, and you'll see that these have yearly bars. the purpose of this is to show the trends, and what you can see here, they go, some of them go up, some of them go down. The key message is that the ones that go up are the fully susceptible ones, so the ones that can be treated by the full panel that we test against, which is what we want. That's the primary indicator, and the one on the left. And the others are all, broadly speaking, showing downwards trends, and those are all of the ones that are measuring resistance. You'll see in the middle of those three resistance ones, that's multi-drug resistance, which is going down, and then other specific resistances on the other two. So broad picture there overall is in the right direction. So then if we move on and look just at the poultry results that contribute to this data for 2022, you can see that on the left-hand side, where you're looking at the results from salmonella, you can see that there's that the full susceptibility to salmonella to the panel of antibiotics tested has increased for broilers and layers, and remained stable for turkeys. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that full susceptibility in E. coli has increased in broilers, but decreased a little in turkeys. And then this slide actually slightly bridges between the two sections of sales and resistance, because what you can see here is the sales data in the line that's going across the screen, and the multi-drug resistance parameter in the blue bars. And we often talk about cause and effect. You know, why are we bothering doing this? What effect is it going to have? And actually, although it's a very difficult thing to answer definitively, this overlay is remarkably, the trends that we're seeing here are remarkably similar. So I think that this is really nice now that we've got all of these years of trend data, that we can overlay this and see that they line up really quite nicely. Of course, there are caveats for this. We're only looking at E. coli multi-drug resistance here. There are lots more parameters, and there's lots more complexity in the detail, as we'll get onto in some of the future in some of the coming slides. The other thing to say is that we're continuing to try and keep expanding, keep enhancing the surveillance that we're doing. And so this slide is really just to flag that we've included some new organisms, some new bacterial organisms in our surveillance this year. So some enterococci species there, because at the moment our indicators, our primary indicators, are E. coli, which is gram-negative. So this includes gram-positive organisms into the trends, of course, starting from 2021. The inclusion of these gram-positives allows us to look for vancomycin-resistant enterococci, and this is something which is of clinical importance to people, which is helpful to now have included in our surveillance. And in this year of testing, we didn't detect any vancomycin resistance in the enterococci. The other thing that we've included in this year is Campylobacter coli. We've included Campi jejuni previously, but we've added in Campylobacter coli. And as you can see in the slide here, you can see the reason that we've included these, that the potential for them to spread resistance determinants. And then the levels of resistance, I'll just move to the next slide so that you can see this in graphical form. So you can see that the trend lines here are for Campylobacter jejuni. The purple one is on the top is broilers, and the green one underneath it is turkeys. And then right at the right-hand end here, you can see a little red point, which is C. coli in turkeys. Oh, excuse me, clicked on the wrong thing. C. coli in turkeys, and then this little blue one right next to the green one, which is C. coli in broilers. So I think this is one of the things which is perhaps of the most clinical relevance, because of course Campylobacter causes foodborne disease in some instances, and some of those clinical cases then in people need treatment, and so that's why this is such an important resistance, because ciprofloxacin was one of those things that's used for treatment of the clinical diseases in people, and of course you see that these trends are not going down, unlike some of the others, and this is not unexpected. Well, maybe a little bit of a decrease in turkeys. It's not unexpected, but they're not going down despite the very, very low use of fluoroquinolones in the poultry sector. Now, this is one of the interesting findings. So one of the other things that we included to enhance the surveillance was looking for a carbapenem, resistance to a carbapenem called ertapenem in the Campylobacter antibiotic panel, and that's done for the first time this year. We've been testing other bacteria for carbapenems for a number of years, and with not finding any resistance to date. But this year, when we started testing for ertapenem resistance in CGG9 E. coli, we found resistance, and you can see that here on the screen. And of course, one of the things with carbapenems, as a lot of you will know, is that carbapenems are not only not used in food-producing animals, but it's legal to use them in food-producing animals. So there wouldn't be any cascade. That it's not just that there are no authorized products, but it's against the law to use them because there is no maximum residue limit for carbapenems in food-producing animals. So there's no stewardship or usage in animals related reason for this resistance to be here. But it's more complex than that because there are questions that have arisen here and in the international community over the methodology, about the way the resistance is measured, and about actually what the significance of the resistance here actually is in a clinical context. So the main thing here is to say that this is an interesting finding, and it's perhaps an unexpected finding, and the clinical relevance, the clinical onward relevance of it to human health at the moment is not clear. So it's not something to get carried away with. But it's something that we need to investigate further and to do some further work up on the isolates and also on the methodology, and further talking and discussion amongst the experts to really understand what this means. And I think, yeah, I suppose the other thing to add on this, of course, is that if we have got a resistance, if this does prove to be a true and relevant resistance, then of course we will need to look at how it's come into the poultry sector. But I think that's far in the future, and I think that there's a lot of work to be done first to understand this better. And then coming towards the end of the resistance slides, the last thing I think to pick out is one of the areas where we do some really specific, focused evaluation of some of the of a subset of the E. coli samples, which is drawn from ones that are grown on selective media. So we're growing bacteria that can survive in the presence of antibiotics. So we're growing the resistant ones, and then we're looking specifically at some of the resistances that this subset is showing. And in this subset, you can see that there was an increase in the proportion of birds carrying ESBL and AMP-C producing E. coli, which are therefore resistant to third and fourth generation cephalosporins. And you can also see that that some of these were resistant to fluoroquinolones as well, and there was an increase in that level. And the interesting thing here is that this, again, cannot be readily explained by fluoroquinolone. The fluoroquinolone resistance can't be readily explained by fluoroquinolone usage because there were no fluoroquinolones used in growing birds in 2022. And I think, therefore, that we really need to understand better some of the routes by which some of these resistances can enter sectors, whether this is through sourcing of birds, whether it's through transmission from other sources through the environment, from other sectors like humans. And so we've got some work that we're taking forward to understand this better. So this is something that I would look at as maybe an early warning. This is the kind of thing where it gives us an indication of where we can start to be investigating things that are coming up when we really look hard for them. But it doesn't detract from the overall headline trends that we were talking about at the beginning of those slides. So concluding remarks, almost concluding remarks. I've got one more slide after this. So just picking up on that last reflection from the last slide, I think really these results show the dedication, the efforts of the veterinary profession and the farming sectors in achieving these overall high-level trends of decreasing sales and usage and resistance. And we really are seeing the value of the data in enabling self-audit. And when we talk about that, that could be benchmarking in a farming sector, or it equally applies to how we look at this information to inform where we should be focusing our priorities in the next National Action Plan that's currently under development. And of course, when we see the resistance issues of concern, it allows us to help understand where we can focus, how we can best mitigate a risk that we identify within the sectors that we all work in, regardless of whether it actually originated there, and how we can mitigate it to protect the effectiveness of antibiotics for treating animals, as well as downstream protection for public health. And of course, as I mentioned just before, this is something that we use integrally in our plans for developing the next National Action Plan, and hopefully it's something that is useful for the sector-led initiatives and the Targets Task Force. And then this really is the last slide I'm going to talk to, and this is really because I wanted to pull it back to what are the take-home messages? What are the key things? If you had, it's a long report. If you don't read it in total, what are the key take-home messages? Well, for me, we've got continuing reduction in total sales with a new low in terms of percentage and mgs per kg and in tonnage. And we've also got incredibly low levels of highest priority critically antibiotic usage at less than 0.5% of total sales. We're also seeing downward overall trends in resistance, as you've seen in some of those slides I showed you earlier, and reducing resistance in our key indicator bacteria, E. coli, since 2014. And I think also contextually, based on the most recently publicly available data, we're also seeing that we're still one of the lowest prescribers of antibiotics in animals, and we've also achieved some of the biggest reductions in resistance across Europe. And of course, we compare with our European neighbours because of our close epidemiological similarities. And so I'd like to leave you with that slide and on that note, and back to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Kitty. Kat, I'll give you a minute to get your slides ready. I'm going to hand over to Kat McLaughlin, who's chair of RUMA. Kitty, I just think listening to your presentation, I've got to be honest, the second half of it, the bit on surveillance, makes my head hurt a little bit trying to follow that. But I think it, as you summarised at the end there, it's really, really important that we do that work, because it is helping to track the other half of the equation in terms of we know what we're using, but is it having any impact? And we've already had a question on that. So I'm sure there'll be some questions to yourself and perhaps Tamsin, who's head of your surveillance unit, when we get to the questions. So I'm going to hand over to Kat, who's going to give us this year's update on the Target Task Force report. Just to remind everybody, these have been published since RUMA set up the RUMA Targets Task Force in 2016, and our first targets were set in 2017, and we're in the second phase, and Kat's going to give us an update on this year's progress. Over to you, Kat.
I'm going to try. Can you let me know when at the minute?
Yeah, still seeing your notes, so that's it. That's perfect, Kat. We can hear you and see you perfectly.
Excellent. There does seem to be a little bit of a delay sometimes, so so thank you, Kitty. That was a really good report, and leads in quite nicely to mine, which is basically to share the latest RUMA Target Task Force 2 report, which we've published today. And this summarises the third year of progress against the current cycle of targets across all UK livestock sectors for data collection, use of antibiotics, uptake of preventative measures such as vaccines and training, and the development of industry initiatives. The latest targets continue to build on the successful implementation of the first set of targets released back in 2017, which helped to halve sales of antibiotics to treat UK farm animals. And as we're seeing from the latest VARSS report, overall sales have reduced now by nearly 60% since 2014. This is testament to the ongoing work and commitment of UK livestock sectors, who have achieved these results through continued voluntary efforts and collaboration. The RUMA TTF report also acknowledges the challenges that have faced UK livestock sectors. There is still fallout from the global pandemic, the UK's exit from the European Union, rising production costs, labour shortages, climate change, ongoing trade negotiations, avian influenza, supply chain issues, and we are now firmly in the midst of the cost of living crisis. Each one of these is a huge challenge, but combined, it makes for a perfect storm. However, this has not deterred commitment to the TTF targets, and the sectors we represent at RUMA Agriculture have a strength, determination and resilience that we should all be incredibly proud of. A resilience that is reflected in the continued efforts and achievements that this latest report presents. A handful of sectors, in response to specific disease outbreaks or other factors, have seen some increases in usage in order to effectively address these challenges and protect animal welfare. This reinforces the point that antibiotics are a vital tool to ensure healthy animals and high welfare standards, and the focus is not on zero use, but responsible use. All sectors continue to strive to keep antibiotics effective and fit for purpose, and only used when necessary. Of particular note in this year's report is the inclusion of some early medicine hub data, which give an indication of antibiotic use in ruminants. It is important to note that the ruminant sector is incredibly complex compared to other sectors, and designing a centralised hub to start collating data has been a significant undertaking. The work that has gone into its development should not be underestimated, and this is just the start of the journey to build an evidence base, from which in a few years' time, baselines can then be produced. What we're seeing, however, in this early snapshot of data from Medicine Hub is confidence and reassurance of the low antibiotic use we expected, coupled with low to negligible HPCIA use. A very positive story indeed. As data submission accelerates over the next couple of years, the data will become more robust, such that industry can set a national baseline of current performance and start to implement specific management protocols within enterprise types. Medicine Hub is grateful for the collaboration of individual farmers, vets, bulk data holders and data interrogators, such as Kingshay, Mapavag, NML, etc., farmer groups, for instance, Welsh beef and lamb producers, Blade Farming, milk buyers, Arla, First Milk, Muller, Barbers, Saputo, Herdwatch Farm Software, the FIAA group and others for sharing or facilitating access to these important data. It is also clear that industry initiatives remain a fundamental part of the journey towards the targets. The numerical targets are important, but so are the various initiatives driven by the sectors and industry that drive engagement and behaviour change. Ongoing collaboration has continued in 2022 between the different ruminant sector bodies on responsible antibiotic use across the UK. Medicine Hub uptake to date has been voluntary, and the scale and complexity of the ruminant sector means it will take time to build up the volume of data. Given the diversity of farms in the sectors, as more enterprises enter data, the usage figures are expected to change. However, the depth of understanding and value of the data to the industry will continue to increase. As data submission accelerates over the next couple of years, the data will become more robust. The data provided for the 2022 calendar year significantly exceeded the targets set by the Targets Task Force. BCVA has continued to provide high-quality training and education to its members in the past year, including collaboration with other industry bodies promoting animal health and welfare initiatives. The Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, the RCVS, revised its undercare guidance on prescribing for vets, commencing September 2023, and this has led to greater clarity for vets in practice on what responsible prescribing looks like, as well as a tightening of the guidelines surrounding antimicrobial and anthelmintic prescribing. In addition, in September 2023, the Board of Dairy UK approved an updated strategy for minimising medicine residues in raw milk. There continue to be many positive developments to report back on across the sheep sector. In sheep, all authorised antibiotic products for neonates were removed from the market from the 2021 lambing season. The HDB vaccine report continues year on year to show an increase in the uptake of a number of sheep vaccines between 2001 and 2022. However, there were considerable vaccine supply issues that impacted availability, and consequently, there has been a small reduction in the use of some vaccines. Vaccine supply issues continue and present a challenge. In September 2023, SAG, that's the Sheep Antibiotic Guardian Group, launched a new industry campaign, Healthy Feet, Happy Sheep, to support farmers and vets with conversations, signposting to tools and resources to tackle lameness, considered a hotspot area of use for sheep. In October 2023, the Ruminant Health and Welfare UK Sheep Welfare Strategy, which runs from 2023 to 28, was launched. Content is centred around 6 goals: appropriate ewe condition, collaborative flock management, healthy feet, positive welfare, sheep comfort and thriving lambs, and the goals support several metrics within the TTF report. The first RCVS Knowledge Awards focusing on antimicrobial stewardship were awarded in 2023, celebrating farm veterinary practitioners who have put antibiotic stewardship principles in place to avoid unnecessary treatments for neonatal lambs and following surgical procedures in both calves and ewes. This slide shows some of the headline achievements detailed in the RUMA TTF report for the cattle and sheep sectors. I'll just give you a couple of seconds to digest it. Okay, in 2022, the pig sector continued to prioritise the health and welfare of the pig herd, reducing the usage of antibiotics by 20% to 72 mg per kilogram PCU. The continuing low use of HPCIAs fell again to 0.01 milligrams per kilogram PCU, with no use of colistin, and further demonstrates the ongoing responsible use to the health of pigs in the country. The 2022 data shows the pig sector has achieved an overall 74% reduction in antibiotic use since 2015 and takes the sector below the RUMA Targets Task Force 2 target. Meeting the target early is a reflection of the extended use of zinc oxide, manufactured before the withdrawal of its marketing authorisation and permitted by the Veterinary Medicines Directorate. The supply of zinc oxide is close to depletion, and it is anticipated that some producers will be unable to find a solution for post-weaning diarrhoea that works for their unit with the current tools available. These producers are likely to be compelled to manage the health and welfare of their pigs post-weaning through the use of antibiotics to treat clinical disease, as has been the case in some EU countries that have already lost the use of zinc oxide. Significant challenges continued for the sector in 2022, although the financial situation improved. The estimated cost to producers of the previous few years was £750 million. The cost of production remains high, and there is significant debt which needs repaying before infrastructure investments can be made. A consequence of the previous 2 years has been the contraction of the UK sow herd by about 25%, leaving us now with the smallest herd the country has had for some time. With a reduction in herd size comes a reduction in levy, which has resulted in the need for HDB to prioritise their work and the subsequent loss of the pig health scheme at the end of 2022. Salmon farmers recorded an overall reduction in the volume of antibiotic used compared to 2021 and 2020. Reductions were observed in both the freshwater and marine phases of production. Antibiotic treatments are still limited to a relatively small number of farms each year, with only 1.5% of freshwater farms and 8.7% of marine farms undertaking an antibiotic treatment in 2022. The 2022 reduction in antibiotic use was achieved against challenging conditions within the marine environment where salmon are farmed. Increased water temperatures and oceanic changes further afield led to significant and much publicised challenges, with blooms of harmful algae and microjellyfish during late summer and autumn. Although antibiotics are clearly not used against such organisms, jellyfish and harmful algal blooms can impact fish health, potentially leading to secondary bacterial infection. The sector continues to monitor its fish and the farming environment on a daily basis, promptly reacting wherever necessary. In 2022, usage of antibacterials in trout sector increased temporarily, above the TTF target to 44.1 milligrams per kilogram in the trout sector. This was in response to an outbreak of Aeromonas salmonicida, I hope I said that right, on a small number of production sites with rainbow trout at a large size and therefore high biomass, meaning that antibiotics were needed for treating disease that would otherwise have had welfare consequences. This is not anticipated to recur, and it is expected that the trout sector will once again fall below the industry target of 20 milligrams per kilogram in 2023. The trout sector has a proven track record of reduced usage over the past 5 years. The extreme weather conditions seen in 2022 caused higher water temperatures, which in turn proved challenging for some farms. The sector continues to look at ways of mitigating issues caused by extreme weather. The industry is committed to decreasing usage, and there is no prophylactic usage of antibacterials. The trout sector is undergoing changes with a move towards larger fish production. This means the tonnage of standard table fish has decreased. Total tonnage has increased based on fewer but larger fish. The game bird sector was heavily impacted by avian influenza in 2022. A catastrophic outbreak in France prevented the importation of hatching eggs to the UK from the usual supply chain in the affected area of France. Consequently, new sources of eggs were explored with varying degrees of success, and most UK suppliers continue to collect eggs for an additional 2 to 3 weeks to try to cover the shortfall. This resulted in poorer than usual egg and chick quality, which had an impact on antibiotic use. However, overall antibiotic use was down by approximately 25% compared to 2021, whereas the number of birds reared was estimated to be 17% lower than 2021. So progress was still made in reducing antibiotic use per bird. This was helped by relatively good weather in the peak releasing months of July and August. Just a few headlines for the game bird sector. 2022 use, we saw 6.4 tonnes against the TTF target of 6.24 tonnes, but with reduced number of birds reared. And in 2022, HPCIA use in the sector fell by 12% to 20 kilos in 2022, but again with 17% less birds reared. The antibiotic use data from members of the British Egg Industry Council, the Lion Scheme for 2022, shows further reductions and continues to be below the target of 1% bird days. And for the 6th year running, no HPCIAs were used. This is a significant achievement, especially in light of the major challenges in 2022, which included cost of production increases and bird flu outbreaks. The Lion Standard continues to focus on bird health through good biosecurity and hygiene, as well as feed and water quality. The industry is continuing the trend for retail supply away from enriched colony cage production and towards free range and barn production, and the sector is confident that it will continue to remain below its ongoing antibiotic use target of 1% bird days and 0.05% bird days for HPCIAs. The sector has maintained robust vaccination programs with good biosecurity, with ongoing cooperation and understanding among vets and farmers that antibiotic use is generally a last resort. The impact of a combination of challenges such as rising production costs, ongoing labour shortages, the impacts of AI, and the burdensome EU-UK trade barriers means British poultry meat businesses are being pushed to capacity. Members of the BPC Antibiotic Stewardship continue to collaboratively drive improvements and best practice across the whole supply chain. As new alternate management practices and therapies come to market, these will be critically assessed and the benefits and experiences gained shared across the sector. The BPC Antibiotic Stewardship believe it is this level of transparent and quality communication across the sector in a pre-competitive space that is key to ensuring continuous improvement. There are many industry initiatives that have been developed in recent years which further demonstrate the industry's commitment to tackling AMR. The report provides an overview of a number of these projects and in some cases a selection of accompanying case studies and testimonials that highlight the initiatives, tools and resources in action. All these initiatives have been generated in the last 10 years and clearly demonstrate the unity and collaboration that is embedded into the industry, in particular a commitment to data collection, training and best practice. And finally, I want to acknowledge the huge commitment that the livestock sectors have made over recent years and that continued commitment. There is still ongoing commitment and the industry continues to challenge itself and ask questions, which continues to drive responsible use of medicines where needed, but always as little as possible and as much as necessary. Thank you to everyone involved in getting this report published and for all the work that's going on in the sectors. Hand back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Kat. That's a really good presentation. I think the two reports complement each other in that we hear the national sales data through the VARSS report and some of the surveillance data, and then the Target Task Force report really tells the story of the huge amount of activity that's going on within all of the sectors, and you've given us a bit of a snapshot to that. There are some questions coming in. I just encourage people to pose their questions now, and we'll pass those on to the respective members of the panel. You've got Kitty and you've got Kat, and in the wings you've got Tamsin Dew from VMD and Fraser Broadfoot. So we've got a panel for you to pose your questions to. Those questions relating to the reports, I would just say that both reports will be on the respective websites. So I've just checked our RUMA report is there under the Target Task Force section reports. And the specific details, Kat gave us a quick run through there, but all of the detail that we've been allowed to publish is in our report. So if you've got specific questions or you couldn't see something on the slides that Kat went through, it's in the report, and I would guide you or direct you to looking at the report and spending a few moments to digest it and answer your specific questions via the report itself. There was another question about recordings. Yes, the recording will be published on the RUMA website. That may not be for a few days. We've got a number of things going on at the moment, but the reports will be published, and we'll make an effort to let everybody on this webinar know that that report, the recording has been published. So to turn to the questions, and I said that the first question was posed earlier on. Josh, you get the prize for the first question from Josh Loeb, I think of Vet Times. And Josh, we're on the same page. It was I sort of thought of a few questions as chairman's prerogative, and your question's the same as my first one, which is basically, I'm going to pose this primarily to Kitty, but Kat, you may have a comment as well. Well, Kitty and Tamsin, actually. Given that we're seeing reductions in the levels of antibiotic use across all of the sectors, and your slide showed a reduction in general reduction trends in drug resistance, is that having any is that making any difference to the animals that we rear and to people? That's the question from Josh Loeb.
I'm very happy to come in on this first, Chris, and maybe first of all, so I think there was a slide in the resistance section of my presentation which kind of tackled this a little bit on the animal side, and I think, I mean, this is something where so the slide I'm talking about is the one where we saw the decreasing usage trend and overlaid with the decreasing multi-drug resistance trend, and the overall sales trend, not usage. And the sales trends, we know that's overall 59% reduction, and the reduction in the multi-drug resistance is 45% reduction. And so those things together and visually. Now I'm quoting Tamsin here, and I'll hand over to her in a moment. So I'm kind of stealing your thunder, but also attributing it fairly. So that we can't definitively prove that these are causally linked. But in Tamsin's word, it's by far the best explanation that we have. That the efforts that are going on in reducing the use are driving what we're seeing in some part on the reducing resistance parameters that we're seeing. But I'm going to hand over, if I may, Chris, to Tamsin to elaborate on that a little if she wants to, but also to pick up the point on the impact on human health. Thanks.
Thanks, Kitty. I think you've summed that up really well. I won't say anything more there, but I will go on to the impact of these reductions in usage on human health. Obviously, this is a lot more difficult to answer. Now, if you look at data for England, you can see that there have been reductions in the number of resistant bloodstream infections in people. That's over the period kind of 2017, 2021. Now, attributing how much of that reduction is directly linked to this reduction in usage and also in resistance that we're seeing in animals is really, really difficult, and we don't have that information yet. Of course, as you can all imagine, there are other factors at play in the human health sector, not least of all, which was the COVID pandemic and the effect of the pandemic on human medical practices. We do actually go into some of the links between animals and people in more detail in the One Health report, which is due for publication later this month. That's something we've worked on with human health colleagues and also our counterparts in the environmental and the food safety sectors as well. So hopefully, if you can all keep an eye out for that, we'll be going into some of these issues in more detail.
Just Chairman's prerogative, if I can come back, Tamsin. In the livestock sector, we're used to resistance to things. I'm a sheep farmer in the past, and we've had resistance to anthelmintics. Does the fact that we're seeing less resistant bacteria at the point of slaughter give us hope that perhaps there's less resistant bacteria on farms, and actually the medicines we're using are going to remain effective for a longer period of time? Because that, I think, is one of the sells to farmers in terms of why go through all of this.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's actually a really good question. I think I just want to highlight a couple of points here. One is that the results that you've seen now from the resistance data, that's taken from animals at abattoirs. So that's more or less reflective of the resistance levels that we're seeing on farms, right? Not exactly, because of course there's transportation and other things, but we should think of it in terms of what resistance looks like on farms. And the other key point that I just want to kind of underline is that the beauty of bacteria is that they can share genes really easily between different bacterial species, right? So the normal E. coli that's just floating around in the gut of the chicken or the pig or the sheep, if that acquires resistance genes, it could share those genes with more pathogenic bacteria, and that might be animal pathogens. It could also be human pathogens. And I'm also bearing in mind that farmers and vets and people who work with animals are coming into contact with these bacteria as well, right? So with all of that in mind, these reductions that we're seeing in our abattoir surveillance are reflective of an improved resistance landscape on farms. And we would expect that ultimately to have ramifications both for what's circulating in animals, but also what people who are working with those animals are coming into contact with.
Great, thank you. Just picking up on that, it's a complicated area of science. I understand that, but I think it's something RUMA's very interested in, this environmental kind of interaction, because we want to make sure that our responsible use. I think we have to accept that there is potentially an impact on the environment. We know that from the use of various things that we do in farming, but we need to minimise that impact where we can. And just coming up later in the webinar series, we've got a webinar on the environment, which will feature a report RUMA's commissioned this year, which looks at some of those vectors that call it leakage, if you like, into the environment from the human medicine side, from hospitals, from sewage works, and from farming. And it's trying to get our heads around that, and in terms of the bits that we can control, the farm side of it, what we may need to do going forward. So I think that there may be more questions on that, Tamsin, but thanks very much for answering that for the moment. Just to encourage you, if you've got questions, please post them in the Q&A at the top of the Teams screen there. Please post your questions. We'll post them when they come in. There's a couple of questions from Lucy Squire. Lucy, I'm going to signpost you to the report for the detailed information, but you asked a question about what was the data on cat slides based on. It was based on the information from Medicine Hub, which, as you know, the industry is beginning to populate, and you'll also be aware that there have been some dairy cattle data sets published over the last couple of years from Kingshay and NML, LMR. Those data sets are now hoovered into the Medicine Hub, so they're included in that data set that CAT's figures covered. I think from memory that represents 28% of the national dairy herd. But please do look at the full report for the data that we were allowed to publish. So looking for more questions from the audience, but I have a few
Chris, sorry to interrupt. I think was one of Lucy's questions about the coverage in the non-ruminant sectors?
Did I not read it correctly?
On the usage. Well, I'll tell you.
So for the sectors which you've reported data on, is there a summary to show what proportion of the total UK herds these data sets cover for each species of each of the species sectors?
I may have misread it. I read that as being more broad than the ruminants. Perhaps I could answer it anyway, because I think it's an interesting question. And there's an easy answer to that, and that's that the other usage data. The other sectors that have supplied usage data, we're looking at 90% coverage or more. So it's much easier to have confidence in the representativeness of the data from those sectors. And that information is in the VARSS report and in the highlights report too. Thanks.
So I'm just going to pose a question to Kat. You've had an easy Q&A session so far. Kat, we're in the midst of the second phase of the target task force. What's next, really? Where does the industry go from here?
Okay, so the RUMA target task force sector groups, they're already looking ahead to the next set of targets, which will be set to take us through the next 4 to 5 years. As ever, targets will depend on the individual sectors, with some focusing on maintaining low levels of use, while others, such as the ruminant sector, will continue to drive data collection still. As you've already mentioned, there's a report that we commissioned on the environment, so we'll be starting to look a little bit more at some of that aspect as well. And we do know that external challenges will continue for the industry, with the threat of disease, for instance, ever present. So especially for those sectors that are focusing on maintaining low use, a lot of the sector targets next time round will be on preventative healthcare. And as I say, it's just going to be continue doing the good things that we're doing at the moment. But to say every sector will be unique and will be different, because that's the way that the RUMA targets have worked. They're all tailor-made for the needs of individual sectors.
And Kitty, coming to you, I know from our discussions within the Target Task Force, we always have one eye on the UK's National Action Plan. We're due a new one that will last for the next 5 years. When's that due out? We had a consultation earlier in the summer.
Yeah, that's right. There was a public call for evidence earlier in the year, and there's been a huge amount of work going on. So it's going to be published in 2024. We don't have an exact date yet, but there's a huge amount of work going on behind the scenes. And the original plan was to aim for the beginning of 2024, but at some point during the next year. Yeah.
So just to for everyone's benefit, that sets out the sort of the UK's One Health agenda in terms of tackling the AMR challenge, and very much the discussions that we'll be having from within agriculture will be, how do we support that? What do we do in agriculture that could support that wider national action plan? And that, as Kat said, that will manifest itself presumably in the third phase of targets at some point. From the back end or into 2025. Kitty, another date, please, if I may. We did the consultation on the VMR, so obviously a lot of what we're allowed to do in agriculture stems from the veterinary medicines regulation, and we had a consultation at the beginning of the year. Excellent consultation, involved the whole of the industry. When do we see that come into force? When will that actually apply to us?
Sorry, finding my mute button. So I haven't got a concrete date for you. I checked in with the legislation team, and we are looking for looking definitely first half of next year. But you're quite right. I mean, there's a huge amount of AMR related stuff in the revised veterinary medicines regulations, and we're really hopeful that it will be presented in a way that it will help people to embed further the stewardship activities and to bring people along that maybe haven't been quite so easy to bring along without the support behind people of that legislative framework.
We've got another question in from Josh. Josh, we're on the same page. He picked up on this point about fluoroquinolone resistance, and as I said to you, that the surveillance makes my head hurt when I'm trying to get my head around it. But I think this is sort of opening up this discussion about what some of the other vectors. It's not just the antibiotics we use on farm. It could potentially be other vectors that are coming to play in terms of the resistance. So the question is, while the graph showed AMR, I think AMR resistance decreasing generally, I think Kitty mentioned fluoroquinolone resistance in meat poultry, which has been increasing despite no fluoroquinolones being used in poultry for years. Kitty, you did touch on that. Could you just expand on that and perhaps support from Tamsin?
Yeah, thanks, and it's a really good one to come back to. I think so. I think it was where I was talking through the Campylobacter graphs, where we've got that those levels of resistance that are kind of sticking. It's not just in the UK that's happening. And I think it's what it really shows us is that preventing resistance emergence is really important. We can look at the graphs where we see reducing antibiotic use being accompanied with reducing resistance, and I think I mentioned when I was talking about that we're looking at one bug here, we're looking at one parameter. It's always more complicated than that. You can always find exceptions. And I think that when we do see those graphs, what we're relying on is the fact that actually, if you remove the selection pressure, you remove the antibiotic pressure for the resistant bugs to do best, then most of the time, a lot of the time, what we're seeing is that then it's the susceptible ones that do best in that environment without the antibiotics. But that isn't always the case, and that may well be what we're seeing with the resistant Campylobacter. And when that happens, there's really your options are limited, and the best option is to use antibiotics as little as possible so that you don't get that kind of thing happening. I mean, you mentioned also, Chris, the point about that complex web of where does antibiotic resistance go once it's arisen somewhere, and where can it arise? And of course, it can arise anywhere, but it's more likely to arise in somewhere where antibiotics where the bacteria being exposed to antibiotics. And so, yeah, absolutely, there is also that really strong need for us to understand better where emerging risks are for incursion of resistant bugs into the sectors that everybody here have a stake in. And that comes back to working out, well, how can we mitigate that risk? Who do we need to talk to? Who else needs to be fully brought into our national action plan? Bearing in mind that our national action plan, here's a plug for this, it's not just a government action plan, it is a whole of UK, whole of society action plan. Everybody has a role to play here. And again, a plug back to the One Health report that Tamsin mentioned earlier, which I should have plugged in my presentation, which is a really good and challenging and interesting piece, which will go a little bit further into this. But I'll pass over to Tamsin in case you wanted to add on to that.
Yeah, thanks, Kitty. I think you explained that really well. I don't really have anything to add beyond underlining, as you say, usage is the best explanation for the changes in resistance patterns that we're seeing, but other things can happen, and that's because of the way that bacteria can evolve and transmit. And I think the fluoroquinolone resistance in Campylobacter is a really good example of the need for vigilance generally, because there is that element of the unexpected that can happen sometimes.
So just to get the report plugin out of the way, so we've got the One Health report. I think you told me yesterday would be available towards the end of the month. We're expecting it towards the end of the month, and hopefully in time before our One Health webinar, which concludes the 5 Wednesdays of webinars that RUMA are running. So hopefully that will be available, and we can look into some of that and comment on that in that final webinar. The RUMA environment report will be the focus of our environment session on the 22nd of November. So coming back to that point of the vectors and the leakage into the environment, that's something that we'll touch on in that webinar. Fraser, I think you've had an easy time so far, so I'm just going to bring you into the conversation. SVAC. We usually get an SVAC report which gives us a sort of a look-see into the European surveillance. When's the report due?
Yes, thanks, Chris. Yeah, the report, which will have the 2022 data from UK alongside the European countries, that comes out on the 20th of November. So that will be coming out very soon.
So it's a busy month for documents to get our heads around. Hopefully we'll cover most of them during the course of the webinars, and we'll certainly be signposting them through our social media channels. Just one other question. We've got a few minutes left, so if you've got a burning question, please post it. But there's one more from me. Just picking up on this environment issue, and we've seen it in previous reports from the fish sectors that seem to be very sort of at the kind of cutting edge of global warming change and how that's impacting farming practices and potentially disease challenges. But in the livestock sector now, we're looking across to Europe and blue tongue vaccines, blue tongue virus moving around Europe. Just a question really open for the panel. What are your thoughts in terms of what we might have to do going forward in terms of the livestock sectors as the environment changes, as we get these more extreme weather events, and just generally as our environment's changing around us? How might that affect our approach to medicine use and health in animals? Has anyone got a comment on that?
Shall I come in on this one, Chris?
Yeah, Kat, thanks.
I mean, look, I think it's one of those things. We all know that the environment is, agriculture and food production is constantly reacting to environmental changes and challenges, as you say. We've seen that fish farming is particularly sensitive to it, but so too are the ruminant sectors and our bird and poultry industries. We know that diseases such as, blue tongue, for instance, back in 2006, that was largely driven by environmental change. Now, fair enough, that's a virus, but any of these kind of viral diseases can sometimes create secondary bacterial infections, which we're going to have to use antibiotics to treat if it's clinically appropriate to protect the health and welfare of the animals. The same is applying across all sectors. And I think this comes back to where RUMA has never been about zero antibiotic use. It's about using antibiotics responsibly, understanding why we're having to use them, using them in the right way, and protecting the health and welfare of our animals in the process. So I think it's one of those things, hopefully, if we start and get the data coming in, we can build on that intelligence that we've got from those data sets. We've got a very engaged sectors across the agriculture and food supply chains. We're all starting to share information. We're going to have to keep sharing information and intelligence with our research communities, with our regulators, our levy bodies, our farmers on the ground, our veterinary profession, pharmaceutical companies. All of that is going to have to continue so that we can actually start and see what potentially is coming down the line and what the most appropriate treatment routes are for it. So I hope that's answered the question. I think it's just a case of the more information and more intelligence that we can gather, the better our response can be, and we can keep going with the responsible use.
Thing to add from the VMD team on that one?
No, I'm only to agree. I think that I mean, some of the slides that we showed on, I mean, I used the phrase early warning when I was talking about some of the resistance slides. I think what we see with data is that if we have the data and we're able to interrogate it, then we are able to understand much better and predict, not predict perhaps, but at least not be caught unawares, not be as likely to be caught unawares. I mean, it's an inexact science in trying to predict the future, but the better the data that we have, the better that we can potentially foresee some of the risks coming our way, and also the better that we can understand the impact of whatever we try to do to mitigate those. So yeah, for me, having the data makes us able to see more clearly.
We're coming to the end of the webinar. There's a couple of questions. Kitty, just a point of clarification on that VMR consultation. Is that the response to the consultation that you were referring to, or the actual implementation of the regulation? Or just to sort of tie you down on the specifics, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking about the implementation of the regulation. The government response will be published sooner than that.
Yeah. And just one final question. I'm not sure if we can go any further into this, but we've been talking about fluoroquinolone resistance. On the sticky levels of resistance, does it mainly seem to be linked with resistance to fluoroquinolone products stroke ciprofloxacin? Have we got any more to add to that?
So is that, are we talking about ciprofloxacin specifically or fluoroquinolones in general? Is that the question? I mean, I think, Tamsin, I think that ciprofloxacin is the fluoroquinolone that's on the panel that we use for looking at resistance in CAMPI. So we look at ciprofloxacin and as a representative of the class. I think that's probably the best answer I can give to that.
I think this one's from Mark, and I think it might be the one of our target task force members, Mark Jelly. So given the massive reductions in antibiotic usage in food producing animals over the last few years, how is the general health of the national herd sectors being monitored? Kat was mentioning about the pig health scheme needing to be discontinued in the pig sector. At what point does reduced use become a national animal welfare problem? So this is about, Kitty, we've talked about this a lot, haven't we, about how we demonstrate as the livestock sectors that if we go lower, that's going to start impinging on animal health. Any comment on that?
I'm happy. Go on, you go, Kat.
No,
happy to come in.
You go first. I'll come in behind you.
An outbreak of politeness. Thank you, Kat. Well, I think what I'll say is that if what we achieve as a consequence of all of this energy on reducing AMR, if what we achieve is poor animal welfare, then we've also failed. This is not about breaking one thing in order to fix something else, and this has very much been on our minds actually as we've been working really hard in the team and to look at, for example, the legislation that we've talked about already that's coming our way. You know, looking at what's the impact, what could be the impact of putting something into law, and I think that we've also it's really at the top of our minds that there are safeguards around this, and there are professional obligations on all sorts of people, and there's the Animal Welfare Act even that anybody who is responsible for animals has a responsibility under law currently to protect their welfare. So all of this needs to be proportionate. This has always been complex, and if we reach a point, what we want to do is to reduce unnecessary use of antibiotics. And we want to reach a point where our use of antibiotics is the lowest that's feasible. And what we hope is that level will be sustainable in terms of keeping antibiotics working for animals and keeping antibiotics working for people. That's basically where we are. Now, if what we find is at some point that the lowest we can go before animal welfare is compromised is not sustainable and doesn't keep antibiotics working, then we have a concrete problem, and then we need to come together and say, how are we going to address this? Now, as far as I can see, we haven't reached that point yet, and I really hope that we don't reach that point. But if we do, then we have to do what we've got a really good track record of doing. In my view, we have to come together and we have to look at it and say, how do we fix this? Because this no longer works, and we have the data that shows that. So that's the perspective from where I am. Thanks.
And I don't think there's much more I can add to Kitty's response. I think that's something that as industry, as you know, representing RUMA, I think we, you know, kind of that's very much what we want to hear and where we want to be. You know, everything that we've done up to now has been voluntarily. It's been based on collaboration. It's been based on intelligence and, you know, and evidence led. But it's also as well about allowing farmers, the vets, everybody involved in farm production and farm animal production to do what they do really well. And I think to kind of, you know, that's where we're going to continue. So I can't really add any more, I don't think.
No, I think that's a nice point to wrap up on, Kat, as well as looking at things from a national perspective. It comes back to the farm, doesn't it? As individual farmers, we're aware of the welfare and the health of our animals. We work with our vets where we need to ensure that, and we're very sensitive to those on-farm things. So I think we tackle it at a farm level as well. Guys, I'm going to wrap things up. I just want to thank all of our speakers and question takers. It's been an interesting session, framed, I think, in the context of a positive story for UK livestock, which very much continues as we contribute to the AMR challenge under the One Health banner, and an AMR issue that's very much on the social agenda and will be for the foreseeable future. With that in mind, I'd just like to remind you all that this was the first of a series of webinars over the next 5 Wednesdays in November. So 10 o'clock Wednesday, hopefully we're in your diary. If you haven't booked in for the other events, you can see the details on our website. And I'd just like to thank you all again for your participation, and to the audience for your attention. Thanks very much to everybody, and have a good day. Thank you. Goodbye.